My guest today is Melissa Florer-Bixler. She is pastor of Raleigh Mennonite Church and a graduate of Duke University and Princeton Theological Seminary, as well as the author of two books, Fire by Night, Finding God in the Pages of the Old Testament, and How to Have an Enemy, Righteous Anger and the Work of Peace. Melissa, welcome to the Good Books.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me on.
I'm really excited to talk to you. Your book, How to Have an Enemy, has been like a very much a source of wisdom for me for the last several years. But before we get into talking through that book and why I think it's really valuable in this moment politically here in the United States, I'd love to hear a little bit about your spiritual tradition and what drew you to being a pastor and a writer in the Mennonite world. I only have like sort of familial connections. I have a lot of family that lives in like the Goshen, Northwest Indiana area.
Okay. Yeah.
But I don't actually know a lot about the Mennonite tradition beyond some of those familial connections.
Okay. Yeah. I growing up had a similar experience. I didn't know a lot about Mennonites. I'm not a ethnic Mennonite. I didn't grow up in Mennonite church. I grew up in the Episcopal Church, but on the conservative ends of the Episcopal Church, my childhood church is a part of the Anglican Church in North America now, so left the Episcopal Church over gay marriage. And when that happened, I was feeling like my parents had gotten a divorce, and I really wasn't very happy with either of them. So that was going on, and it was also the beginning of the invasion of Iraq, and we'd already been embroiled in war in Afghanistan, and it just was this kind of the first time for me of a real struggle with what it meant to be a country at war, like a hot war, not the Cold Wars, not that sort of just came and went, but this really extended, prolonged war that was over oil. And that was a time where I felt like I just wasn't hearing from the Christians in my life a sustained witness against militarism, against what we were seeing happen in the invasion of these countries, except from one place, which was the Mennonite Church. I'll also say the Quakers at this time too. But I started going to a Mennonite church around that time, around 2003, and I just felt like had met people who took Jesus really seriously in a way that felt much, when I say that, was very different than the kind of what it meant to take Jesus seriously of my youth. And that looked like things like Peter Dula, the Mennonite Pastoral Committee worker, going to Iraq and being there during the invasion and refusing to have armed security guards, because that's what it means to follow Jesus, is that we don't kill our enemies. And I would hear stories like this and just think, oh wow, if I'm going to do this like Jesus thing, I want to do it with like this kind of seriousness. And
Yeah.
And so that's how I ended up going to Mennonite churches. The other piece of that was really different for me was, of course, when you're in high church traditions, you have a priest who's up in front of everyone, and they have a robe on. They're mediating the sacraments for you, which is really the center of worship life. And when I was in the Mennonite church, the first couple of times I went to the first Mennonite church I went to in North Carolina, I didn't know who the pastor was. I had no idea, because different people talked to me, and one person was leading worship and another person was preaching, but that wasn't the name of the person who was the pastor. And it just was very clear that the role of the pastor was very different than everything I had seen growing up to this point. And so that's really when I started to think, oh, this is the sort of thing I can do. I want to be with the people. I don't want to be standing in front of everybody in a stole that looks different and sets me apart. But I would love to be a part of helping people figure out how to do this kind of life together and figure out what their gifts are and how to use them for worship in our world, and ask these complicated questions that are always new, right? Because there's always new questions before us, and figure out how we live into them together through this book we call the Bible and through the life of this person named Jesus. Yeah, and so that led me to seminary and been pastoring Mennonite churches since then. Um, Mennonite Church is actually, we're having our 500th anniversary this year. 1625 was the first time that there was the baptism upon confession of faith in Zurich, Switzerland, by the group of guides who got together for this illegal worship service in defiance of both the Roman Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church, which really set off the spark of what ended up being this pretty revolutionary peasants movement that kind of got combined with a lot of apocalyptic preaching and teaching. It's heavily persecuted in the first decades of the movement because it was so resistant to the government, and then sought refuge in different places around the world, but ended up being a church home for folks like me. So that's a little bit about.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And now it's been around for 500 years now. It is an established tradition. What are some general stats as far as like as far as how large or diverse the Mennonite tradition is? As you did mention, there are for some people, there is like a bit of an ethnic connection at this point, but that's certainly not the case for everyone. And it wasn't the case for yourself. And as I mentioned, I just like, again, this is my own ignorance. So I'm asking also on behalf of the audience.
Sure. Yeah, we are a tiny minority religious community in this country, in the United States, and in the world. And so one of the sort of the aspects about Anabaptism was, I think because it was a holiness tradition, because the community had to work so hard to maintain this very strange life of shared communal goods and pacifism and not taking oaths, it led to a lot of splits within the community. And so you will have people who, like me, women who are pastors, all the way over to people who drive horses and buggies who are Mennonites, old order Mennonites. And so we also have churches that still speak Plattdeutsch or German and had German services. And then we also have churches that are Garifuna churches and Hispanic churches and churches that speak Hmong. And like many traditions, the largest number of Anabaptists in the world right now is on the continent of Africa. Very early mission work meant that there's a large Javanese Mennonite population in Indonesia, and very quickly became a indigenous church. And the same thing happened in Ethiopia. It's a large population of Ethiopian Mennonites and Eritrean Mennonites. So like a wildly diverse and very small community that, like all of our communities, finds ways to care for one another and also to each other.
Yeah, yeah. And clearly there was this element just in the way you told your story. A lot of your exploration of these things was rooted in civil or political concern and meeting your expression of faith. Based on your writing and some of the other things I know about you, I know you also do local work or activist-oriented work. What sort of drew you to that aspect of engagement? Because that's certainly not the path for everyone that's in the pastorate. Some people may work, if they're a local pastor, then they are generally involved, but they maybe not to the degree that you have been.
Yeah, I cut my teeth in organizing with the Industrial Areas Foundation, which is Saul Alinsky's model for broad-based organizing in the 1940s and continued on to this day with affiliates around the country and in other places in Europe. And I think that's really the first place when I was still a grad student where I saw the power of coalition building for social change. And so I think it was always a part of my imagination because of that's part of the pastoral responsibility, is to be into organized people power, because we have well-organized corporations and we have a not well-organized government. And then we have a lot of ordinary people who if we organize collectively, can shift things in our local community. And if you're in the local community, right, all of that is just, not even just at your back door, it's in your pews. It's just like it has been for me. I think that's the other piece of it.
Hmm.
I, I sometimes wonder, maybe less charitably, when I see fights or like disagreements about pastoral roles of organizing, do you have any poor people in your church? And it feels like there's an immediacy to
Hmm.
this when you have working class people and people with undetermined immigration status and trans people, and we just had someone who was illegally fired from her federal job, right? And these are the people who are literally in your life, right?
Hmm.
And so it went without saying that when Leah said, my union is organizing this protest, that we would be there, right? And this is our person. Leah's our person. And we're in a hostile government takeover, and she needs us to show up for her, right? And
Hmm.
so I feel like more than a decision to do it or not, it was like, this is what spills over from a community that kind of takes seriously Acts 2 in the ways that we can in late stage capitalism, right? We may not be able to have all of our things in common, but but our worship life just spills over. It is so full, it overflows into the community that we're a part of. Um, and it
Hmm.
recognizes that there are other people in that position too, right? Who are also end up being our people, and as we are in these organizing relationships. So how it goes.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate that detail because it definitely provides that connection and what motivates you to write a book like this, like How to Have an Enemy. And that book came out in 2021. And I personally, as your reader, as your audience, I'm convinced it's more relevant today than it was when it came out. I don't know how you
Very
feel about that as
unfortunate.
the
Very, very
author.
unfortunate. I wanted it to never be relevant again, but we are not a people
Yeah.
who learn our lesson. So here we go again. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And one of the things that I very much appreciated about your book is the way that it focuses on power. And in order to segue into talking about some of the ideas from your book, I do want to read a passage from it if that's all right with you, that I think will ground some further comments that that you may have about the work. Is that all right if I read a little bit
That's
from
great.
Manila?
Try to do
Okay,
it. Try
okay,
to do it in
great.
my voice though. Try to imitate me if you can. I'm
Okay.
kidding. Yeah.
I don't I,
That'd be amazing,
all
but
right.
no
Here
pressure.
we go.
Yeah.
Here we go. Power separates difference from enmity. I use the language of enemies in this book to describe a relationship between people, one that recognizes how a person uses their power, actively or passively, to harm or dominate another. When there are enemies, one is in power over the other, or there is a conflict over who holds power. Power is not bad. We need power to act. Exercising power is how we make our lives better. We need power to make choices and to assure our thriving. But calls to Christian unity that ignore the dynamics of racial, gendered, and class power end with devastating consequences. As it is, not every conflict is one of enmity. We can misconstrue who our enemies are. We can falsely assess our power and that of our supposed enemy. We do not always rightly gauge tolerable difference. And then, gonna skip forward a little bit. In order to understand enmity rightly, we are required to distinguish between the fear of losing power and the fear of being harmed. And I love all of that. The but where I want to start is that sometimes, even though we know that we're so divided and all the things everybody says all the time about our political climate, even amongst social equals or people that have similar levels of, let's say, executive power or like significant power, there's it's still it can still be very difficult to have conversations. And I want to start with the people that are similar to us white people. And for a lot of people that are white Christians or post-Christians, whether they use a term like evangelical or whatever else, notions of power and privilege are difficult for them to talk about or even keep in mind. And I'm curious, as someone who is a local pastor, what are some methods for that particular audience of other fellow white people that you've seen be successful in piercing that reticence or that white fragility, so to speak? And if there is any, and if that has changed over, especially over the last few years, as things just have gotten more and more amped up.
Yeah, that's a great question. But I do think that the sort of returning to power as not as a bad word, but as something that we can think about in some ways neutrally. It's something, this is something that it changes hands, right? It's there's,
Mm-hmm.
we can hold it, we can store it, we can build it. Like we use this kind of language, like almost like Play-Doh, right? Like you can manipulate it, you can change it, you can share it, you can give it away, you can take it. And I think the reason that's helpful is because it provides a basis for us it thinking about how our world functions and how we act in the world, which I think is a
Mm-hmm.
lot. Also then broadens the scope of the way that power works beyond just what happened for individuals, right? Which is a project of liberalism, right? That which I think is what in like more leftist circles has been a concern about the way that the conversation has happened over the past few years. It's like, yeah, we don't want microaggressions. That's great. We want more people. DEI initiatives are really helpful for lifting people up out of who've been overlooked or have been erased by the way that whiteness like disguises itself as meritocracy. And we've got a system that doesn't work, right? We've got a system like that. There's no amount of individual change that is going to take account of the way that power is basically structured into our economics, into capitalism, into our racialized identity, into our institutions, into our government. And so that I feel like shifting ourselves to thinking about power offers us a window into the ways that we are all mutually bound up in this system and how that system is actually bad for all of us, right? That's a system we all need to be freed from. We need to dismantle it for the wellness of our planet, of other creatures, of older adults, of younger adults, of queer, of straight folks, right? This is all these struggles end up being bound together. And that I think could be really helpful instead of just when I hear resistance to this, it's usually because there's a sense of feeling blamed or personally responsible for the way that power is structured and that you can do something about it on your own. That's not necessarily true. What is true is that we have systems that need to be dismantled and we can all be a part of that work and we need to be a part of that work together.
Right, right. But it's that strain of sort of like identitarian, like you attach your identity and your sense of worth, and if you feel it's under attack, then you may, instead of recognizing, as you've said, that power is this external thing. It's something that we can talk about and change. Instead, it's that sort of becomes the barrier for some people, right? Is that if they think they're being blamed or what have you, then they may not want to listen to the rest of what you have to say.
Right. But what's happening right now, right? We live in an election cycle where economic problems were blamed on immigrants, right? And as if, so here we have the pitting of poor people against each other, white working class poor people against Latina working class poor people. And look who won. Like, look who won. Like, that when I mean, we
Hmm.
call that relationship racial capitalism, right? That it is to the benefit of our capitalist structures that people who are poor find ways to be divided. Because the more divided you are, the harder you can't resist the structures of these powers together. And that all we have is people power. Yeah. So
Right. Right.
it is also strategic, right? This is also it is to our benefit to find these ways to be in coalition, to be in relationship with one another, so we can do this work together.
Yeah. And I I want to just use a segue from the one of the words you just used, coalition. So as far as the I apologize. I want to go a different direction. So this will be a little edit for myself
No problem.
for later because I do want to get to that, but I was jumping around a little bit. I actually want to step back and we did start by talking about power, but I do think that for some people who really do out of a desire to be a peacemaker, out of a desire to be someone that tries to build bridges and that sort of thing. There are some people within Christian circles and liberal leftist type circles who do want to extend a hand and do that sort of thing. But there is value in also understanding who your enemies are or who is working at opposite ends. So could you talk a little bit about that and what the value is of speaking plainly and saying these people, these systems should be viewed as enemies and what the value is in saying it in such stark, clear terms.
Yeah, I think that what having this identity of enemies does for us is helps us to understand what it's going to take, what it is that we're facing, right? And I think a lot of that means shifting who we consider it. Getting who your enemy is correct will determine how you shape your future. So that's back to this
Mm,
example again, that if your enemies are not billionaires, they're immigrants, right? You're going to shape your life around trying to end the presence of brown people in the country, right? So it really, really matters that we understand who it is, who is the source of the structures of power that we're trying to dismantle among us. And equally as important for us to understand who is not. And so I think I'm thinking about we're saying this book came out in 2021 during the first Trump administration. And so I've just been thinking a lot right now in the company of like Quakers like Daniel Hunter and Choose Democracy about what it means to be a movement that can invite people back in after they're disillusioned with the Trump administration.
mm,
And that feels really hard, right? That's really, really hard work to say, hey, you got this wrong. And now you lost your social security check and you don't have SNAP anymore. And now you know. And instead of just saying, I'm never going to work with you again and sorry, it's over for you, we can't do this. It's actually a good strategy for us and probably good religion for us to be able to say, okay, what does it mean for us to rebuild trust and to be able to figure out now that you know who our actual enemy is, how do we start building what we need to change the situation that we're both in, because we're both in it now. Um, and so that's actually in some ways like I don't want to be too Pollyanna about this, but we're just going to have a lot of disillusioned people. We already are
hmm
seeing this, right? This sort of Trump regret. I just think what work do we need to do among ourselves as organizers, as churches, to say, again, it isn't saying, oh, it's fine. We all can agree to disagree here. And no big deal. And it's to say, hey, let's name what happened here. Like let's get to the truth about what we're experiencing. And let's find out what we actually have to do to shift the reality that we're in now.
Hmm. And one part of your title, and then a considerable part of your book is about some of that difficult personal emotional work of processing anger. And I think that that is also highly valuable in this moment because the people that have been organizing for years and may be seeing these newcomers that may have that sort of zealotry that comes with being like a new convert, so to speak, or a new partner in some sort of initiative. What what is the posture, or whether you're someone who has that righteous anger or someone who is recognizing the error of their ways? What is it? Because I do think that your your book is titled very specifically "Righteous Anger in the Work of Peace." So, what role does the expression of that anger have, especially in this moment? I think just to again contextualize it into the political climate that we're in, of folks who didn't want Trump to win and feel both disillusioned and tired and we got to do this again. And some people, their anger may be burned out or it could just be simmering.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious what's your what is the role of anger and the role of processing it still the same? People are still people, even though it's been 4 years and stuff has happened. I'm curious about your thoughts now.
I do feel like, in some of the ways that you pointed out, that in some ways there's been a shift from, in at least in my circles and the world I'm in, this very visceral anger to just grief and exhaustion,
Mm-hmm.
which I think we have seen in how there were not a million people who came out to protest Trump's second inauguration, right? That didn't materialize in the same way as the first. But I also think that what part of what that's done is it's drawn people into communities that are doing the deeper work of organizing more than activism. Of course, thinking about those differences, but I really I continue to see that, or maybe this is just what we've learned, that we have to make space for these emotions in different ways. And I think we did learn that from the first time around. So we had, I'm a pessimist. I had a feeling something bad would happen. And I had planned this prayer service for the day after the election, knowing that there would be great, great grief, great anger from my congregation. A lot of, like, I share with you, sort of our population. And so to intentionally continue to make spaces for that, to say your anger is also welcome here, right? This is, even this Sunday, there's a song that's in the Mennonite hymnal, that's this chant that is, how can our anger give life? How can our anger give life? And it's just those words over and over again, also written since the last administration, right? But I think that because we've been through that and we felt the exhaustion of just how simmering that rage was all the time. And we just had never been through it before. If we'd done this, all of these tactics feel familiar. But I think continuing to create spaces in worship in our communities to allow for that emotional resonance and to transform it continues to be really important.
And what do you mean? What do you envision when you use a term like transform it? Like, is that specific to the community where it's happening? What do you have in mind when you think of that aspect of?
Yeah, anger is energy. It's a lot of energy, and grief is a lot of energy. And so that we can let that sort of eat us from the inside, or we can turn it against one another, or we can make it into something. And so I think about that image again in from the book of like that anger is a spotlight, right? That can show us, it can point out what's wrong in our world. Like that feels like such an important metaphor.
Hmm.
And yeah, so we have, I think, when we have communities and people to share our anger with, the possibilities of turning that into something. And not even, I'm cautious about saying something productive. Like it doesn't even need to be productive. It can be into just the relationship, right? It's really important to be able to be angry with other people right now. And yeah, we need like a common, like everybody goes out at like midnight and screams, like a collective scream
Yeah.
into the night. But that sort of being angry together is much better than being angry alone.
Right. Yeah. And that is, I totally agree. And I think there is, for as much value as there is in online connection, I think there's a lot of value in being with people in person when it comes to that commiserating. Yeah, having misery together.
That's very mhm.
It can be very healing in its own way. I want to shift to talking about starting with Christian versus Christian sort of disagreements, because Christianity is still very much, even though the American populace is not necessarily as religious as our politics is, there are two very discordant sort of views of what Christianity should do and what it should prioritize and how it should be lived out in our politics. On one side, you have Project 2025 and Christian nationalism and everything that entails and all the various terminologies that have been floated over the last 10 years, and especially since January 6th, to understand what's happening. And then you also have the more sort of social gospel oriented traditions, and they are present, and those same strains can be present within a single tradition. You can have trad Catholics and nuns on the bus, or any other number of examples. But I'm curious, as like from your work of like doing this writing a theological treatise about enmity and anger and peacemaking, how you in particular have viewed the last few years of these types of Christianity just being going in very different directions, and how that plays out at the various levels of society, whether it's in a local church, within a single denomination, and also just in the broader public and the way in which we talk about how religion and politics and civic life intersect. So I'm happy to go any direction you would like, but that's a bit of table setting, but that given your expertise in this sort of space and both your experience in the theory side as well as the organizing and just being a presence in your local community, that's the thing that we need to know
Yeah.
about. So I'm very curious about what how you're looking at this current moment in our political and civic life.
Yeah, I think what makes it even more complicated is that there are even fissures within, right? Or just for bridges even complicate that picture of social gospel on one side and the Christian nationalist picture on the other side. And I really
Hmm.
think that one of the places that I have seen this the most is in organizing around Palestine this past year through Mennonite Action, which is the place I've dedicated a lot of my time and energy since October 7th. And really watching even churches that I think have typically been consider themselves progressive in the front lines of all of these social movements, very uncomfortable talking about what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in the West Bank. And so there's some fissures there, right, around respectability and risk and what it means for your institution to stand out for this issue, which is usually the one that people don't want to talk about, right? I think about this lawsuit that recently went forward against DHS. Mennonite Church USA was like the first signature on that, but the ELCA didn't sign on to, right? They're in cited some polity differences around, and so I think we're getting to see a little bit more of the landscape of the church at this time as we're facing some new challenges and new organizational challenges that we would like to think having such a formidable enemy on the other side would really make it clear that this is the time where we need to like figure out how to do this together. And that's just not always the case, right? Or we have to take seriously these ways that we may not necessarily think that we're as together as we believe we are. Just because we can say Project 2025 is bad, that doesn't mean that you're actually willing to get out there and oppose it. Or Project Esther is bad, or you really willing to like do something about it. I don't know if I necessarily consider that a struggle. It is a helpful clarification about the way that the questions that all of our traditions need to be asking, and specifically about what are we willing to risk, right? That's because I think at the end of the day, what we're really talking about, right, is institutions that want to survive. Mm-hmm. And if that's really what we're seeing emerge as the most important thing, we are just not going to be able to get things done. Right. So I'm noticing that here within this landscape we're seeing.
Yeah. Yeah. Institutional concern. That's always been such a head scratcher to me, just in that a lot of, and I guess this is a little bit of a mainline bias. I grew up a Methodist.
Yeah.
And I've definitely been a Protestant wanderer, but these denominations have been saying they've been dying for decades, and you would think that, but there's still a lot of reticence to lean into some of the more prophetic type of things that I think a lot of, whether they are people in the pews or people in the pulpit, sometimes wish that those denominations could be a bit bolder, but yeah, I guess it makes sense that at a time of intense pressure, that is when you would see those fissures start to come to the surface and make themselves known.
Can I say something?
On that note,
can I say something else about that?
Yeah.
Though? But the other part
absolutely.
of that's been really interesting. It has also created this opportunity for coalition with people who are also sort of maybe not at the center or also at the edge of their traditions, expectations, or what it's willing to take on. So I think about like Jewish Voices for Peace, right? I don't know that we would be in coalition with them in the same way in Mennonite Action if like a ton of churches had stepped up and been like, yeah, we want to like really speak out against what's happening in Gaza, right? I don't know if Muslims for Social Justice wouldn't have the same relationship. So it's just interesting that in some ways, like the failure of the church to step outside of maybe some of those expectations has actually created like relationships and organizational possibilities beyond the church.
Right.
Which I just love. I'm like, God's going to do what God's going to do. And if we're not going to be a part of it, somebody else is going to, and we just look for it and jump on board.
Yeah. Yeah. And on that note, do you see possibilities for future coalitions that extend not just beyond ecumenical and interfaith things, but to those that may now identify as secular or non-religious or atheist, that entire spectrum of belief or non-belief, however you want to frame it? Do you see value and possibility in having a shared enemy or a common cause, whether you look at it from the negative or antagonistic view of having an enemy, or just having an ally.
Yeah. And I'll say that like GDP includes folks like that too, who are Jewish, but also maybe atheist or
Hmm.
non-religious. And so
Sure.
we already
Right.
are
Yeah.
seeing that there's a little more space for that in Judaism than there is in Christianity. But yeah, I do think that there is some pressing out beyond those borders. I think what makes it a little harder is that we don't have a lot of we have those kind of third spaces. We hear a lot about this are disappearing. And so
Hmm.
there aren't sort of natural places to connect with people. Whereas like we have an anti-Zionist synagogue. And so those are the people that we know how to connect with, right? And it's a lot harder to know what the space is for people. Like it used to be like you were maybe part of the Lions Club or Kiwanis or something, right? Or even
Hmm.
like a bowling league, or best of all, your union, right? People just aren't part of unions as much anymore. They're getting more unions, thankfully, in the past 5 years. But I think the question is really what's the way to capture people for those movements beyond just being individual? And maybe you know the answer to that, and I don't know it.
No, no.
So
This is the open question,
yeah,
right? Is like what given the extent of resources and networking that we know is being done in order to advance things like Doge and Project 2025 and all these things that that you and I would like are not fans of. I think I can safely say that
you can.
is just how to emulate that, because one of the odd sort of things is as American culture has become more atomized and individualized, that the funny thing is that like the people that built the modern religious right looked to the civil rights movement and to older activism movements with in that tradition, and that's where they got their that they cribbed all those notes.
Yeah.
And it's just a matter of rediscovering those traditions, or learning from the wisdom of so many other organizers from the past and the present, without and not doing it in an appropriative way, but in an appreciative way that gives people their flowers and just desserts and everything. But it's not very straightforward, and it's what is occupying my mind, being in both Christian and more non-Christian spaces. Do you think that on that note, do you think we have like either a common language or common cause that's and I'm not necessarily saying this as far as like party leadership or anything like that at high levels, but just amongst individuals, amongst the public, what is your what is your perspective on our capacity to have conversations to build those sorts of connections and those sort of long-term coalition building that we need to do in this moment?
And I wonder if that's going to come about less and again, this is another, not meaning to be Pollyanna-ish, who's going to be really painful in a lot of ways, but as we see a shrinking safety net, what we have is each other, right? Those aren't
Hmm.
conversations that we need to have. We need to know how to get food to our neighbors or to protect the people down the street from ice showing up at their house, right? Or someone's car stops working. And so I think that we we seem to do better when when we have real need for each other. And this is also just an opportune time to start organizing your neighborhood. We did a training session on mutual aid shortly after the election, just to get people ready to start thinking about this. Like, do you know who your neighbors are to your left and right? Do you know if there's an elderly person in your community whose social security check could stop coming, and who's going to go check on that person, right? It could be that there's some opportunity here, because I think it is hard when you're saying, let's sit down and have a conversation and see, I'll tell you what's important to me, tell me it's important to you. But coalitions form out of necessity most of the times. Like
Mm-hmm.
you can't do this without other people. Like you literally can't do it without other people, which is again, I think, part of the problem with this sort of like the kind of unity language we hear. It's just mushy. What are you unifying around? You're not unifying around bread, right? Like literal bread, not like the bread of life. Like it's usually around an
Yeah.
idea. Like,
Yeah.
but when you gotta
Mm-hmm.
eat, you gotta get people there and you feed each other. I think one example of this is when the congregation I pastor was thinking about just what kind of new work needs to happen in terms of our anti-racism following the murder of George Floyd. And there was this recognition of like, it feels like forever we've been like, let's go talk to Black people about what we need to learn, or let's read another book, let's have another book study. And the true sense of actually what we need to probably do is organize with a historically Black church around an issue, and then let that be the basis of the relationship instead of the other way around. Like where we spend 3 years making this poor Black church hang out with white people that they don't have time to hang out with. And then maybe at the end of that, we'll decide
Yeah.
we want to like, I don't know, go to a march together. And so we ended up in this relationship with St. Ambrose Episcopal Church, which was a historically Black Episcopal church in Raleigh, because they were facing a real crisis with a land developer who was going to further erode the floodplain and like cause their church and their neighborhood to flood catastrophically over the next 10 years.
Wow.
And we're like, all right, let's throw down on this together. Like, let's go to city council, let's get our people out. And that's where the relationship came from. And they showed up for us when we need them. And I do think there is like, we just need more materialism. I'm not a materialist, but I'm really close. Like the ground. Yeah. Again, the reason Jesus talks about bread is because we need it to survive, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
what bread is about. It's not an idea. It is something that feeds people. And so finding our way to places like that, I think that's where all this begins.
Of your of putting these ideas to work and focusing on something that is tangible and working. That's such a wonderful sort of button for our conversation, I think. I'm trying to think if there were any other additional thoughts, because that was just very poignant.
No.
Yeah. Sorry, yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing that. There's going to be a little bit of a cut here.
Totally fine.
Because I'm just sort of sitting with that story and yeah. That was such a really wonderful example to close out our conversation on. The book is How to Have an Enemy, Righteous Anger, and the Work of Peace. Melissa, where else can people find your work online or elsewhere? What else are you up to that you might want to mention here?
Yeah, I've entered the world of Substack, which I'm not always great at posting things, but yes, that's where I drop things from time to time. And I write a column for the Christian Century, so you can, read me there and catch up with me on Blue Sky.
Great. All right, Melissa, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks.